Welcome, everyone, to the Fall Speaker Series sponsored by the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, or RIDM. My name is Lisa Lowe, and I'm a professor in American Studies and the program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. I would like to acknowledge the Quinnipiac, Pequot, and Mohegan peoples, the traditional caretakers of the land on which we're meeting, and we read and teach and live. I would also like to thank colleagues at RIDM, Director Stephen Putty, Associate Director Matthew Tanico, and Nicole Edwards for their support and assistance that's made possible this entire Fall Speaker Series. RIDM, which was founded in 2016, is the academic research center that houses the undergraduate program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration. I'd also like to thank the chair of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, Professor Alicia Schmidt-Camacho, who led us last spring to become an independent academic unit, and Margaret Homans, and colleagues in women's, gender, and sexuality studies who are co-sponsoring our speaker today. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Kalindi Vora, who is Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at University of California, Davis, and the Director of the Feminist Research Institute there. She previously taught at UC San Diego in the Ethnic Studies Department and was affiliated with the programs in Science Studies and Critical Gender Studies. She's a leading scholar of globalization, bioethics, and transnational women's labor. And her work on transnational commercial surrogacy, the global division of care work, and robotics and artificial intelligence combine empirical and cultural analyses, speaking to the most pressing issues in the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. Her analysis of the transnational outsourcing of biological and affective labor compels us to reconceive not only the labor theory of value, but also the boundaries and definitions of human life itself. Her work has been recognized by distinguished fellowships and foundations, including the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellows Program, the Mellon Foundation, and the UC Humanities Research Institute. Her first monograph, Life Support, Biocapital and the New History of Outsourced Labor, published in 2015 by University of Minnesota Press, examines the ways that both scientific medical technologies and contemporary forms of global outsourcing and accumulation have opened up the human body and subjectivity for annexation, harvesting, and exploitation. Considering human tissue and organ sales, commercial surrogacy, and varieties of care work from domestic labor to call center work, she analyzes the commodification of not only reproductive labor, but affective and biological life as new sites of resource and territory. She emphasizes that the accumulation of what she calls biocapital, like that of colonial capital before it, profits from an international gendered division of labor. Thus, these forms of affective, biological, and reproductive labor, customarily under-theorized or overlooked in Western political economy, builds upon an earlier colonial organization of production and are signs of the present neoliberal globalization of capitalism. Kalindi Vora's co-authored second monograph with Neda Tanasaki, Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robots, and the Politics of Technological Futures, published just last year by Duke University Press, examines automation, robots, artificial intelligence, drones, and other technologies that serve as surrogates for human workers within a labor system that continues to uphold racial capitalism, patriarchy, and empire. These technologies demonstrate that even as innovations promise revolutionary liberation from labor inequality, the technologies are central media for the social reproduction of the very dispossessions, differences, and exploitations that they promise to transcend and remedy. Kalindi Vora continues to work on transnational assisted reproductive technology, analyzing clinics in India in which different parties, cultures, and social actors meet under radically asymmetrical relations of power. In her essay, co-authored with Malati Iyengar, Citizen, Subject, and Property, she discusses the negotiations of transnational and local actors in the settings of an Indian clinic, in which the meaning and importance of reproductive surrogacy transforms former Indian understandings about kinship, heredity, debt, obligation, embodiment, and community. Her current research continues ongoing writing on the legal and social justice concerns connected to commercial surrogacy, ongoing studies of feminist approaches to artificial intelligence and robotics, and a book project on anti-capitalist structures of care and responsibility, social reproduction, and social reproduction. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kalindi Vora, who will speak today on inefficient feeling, care,
It's okay, keep going.
Care as revolutionary praxis at the end of society.
Thank you. Oh, no, it's fine. All right. Technology. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I understand that there are a lot of other things competing for your time and attention, so I'm pleased that you can make it. I'm just going to go ahead and start. In July of 2016, a team of multidisciplinary scientists and aerospace engineers based at NASA's Langley Center published a paper proposing a project to study the potential for human reproduction on Mars. They're calling it the Multi-Generational Independent Colony for Extraterrestrial Habitation, Autonomy, and Behavior, or MICEHAB. The short-term goal of the experiment is to send a mouse colony into orbit to study how spaceflight and partial gravity impact health and birth rates over 3 generations. A proposed 600 cameras would observe the colony, whose care would be charged to Earth-controlled telerobots. The concept video, which I'll show a clip of in a moment, compares the experiment to the Lewis and Clark expedition, as it is designed to scout for the possibility of establishing a human-based version for a Mars colony. I'm going to show you 2 very brief clips, hopefully the sound works, to give you a sense of the imaginary behind the project.
NASA is currently designing approaches to explore Mars with an emphasis on a pioneering approach similar to the Lewis and Clark expedition, where the spacecraft will be designed to support the growth of a large mouse colony for year-long durations, studying reproduction and maturation of mice over multiple generations. The interior consists of multiple levels of specially designed mouse enclosures, which can be removed from the main cylindrical structure for cleaning and maintenance. The colony maintenance robot, housed on a center adjustable platform, services the enclosures. The habitat is designed to autonomously support the mice throughout their life cycle, including food, water, waste management, and medical care. Mice can be selectively bred to create generations which have only lived in partial gravity, while preventing overbreeding. These future generations can be observed to understand mammalian reproductive challenges, physiological changes, and altered behavioral characteristics. This facility can also address other human exploration research goals, including collecting data on how the radiation in deep space affects human health. The systems on board the facility will also be tested to benefit the development of human systems, including demonstration of autonomous robotic maintenance and long-duration operations in a deep space environment.
So, reproduction through generations of mice is a time-tested structure for laboratory studies of genetic and epigenetic change. MICEHAB is a model study for human reproduction, where the model of genetic change over generations in a lab-like setting, I will argue, necessarily engages a history of capture, the capture of human reproduction as a source of wealth through colonial and chattel slavery economies, and its eventual translation into eugenics and population science. Many of us in the field of ethnic studies have been following the discourse on Mars colonization, which has mounted with the evidence of the climate change of the Earth. The model of revolutionary change in this imaginary, embraced and promoted by techno-elites like Richard Branson and Elon Musk, is to leave a dying planet to reproduce life elsewhere, bringing the same historical formula of the human and its reproduction through generations along with them. In my past work, I've argued that the antecedents of contemporary bioeconomies, which rely on being able to patent innovative knowledge and to exploit the undervalued and often invisible reproductivity of humans and other organisms, as well as of their parts like tissues and cells, were present in the economies of colonialism and chattel slavery, in which dehumanized and unfree workers were also self-reproducing capital. For me, the Mice Hub project imagines a continuation of this logic into future technological infrastructure that will also continue to influence the structure of the human subject and of society. So my current research looks at the imaginaries of both radical change and human futurity implicit in the design of new technologies, and considers alternatives to ask, how do we work with the world we have, given its historical roots in colonial science, reproductive science, and our limited models for sustainable relations of care to forward a different model of the human altogether? This question has come out of my 2 book-length studies and a 3rd ethnographic study, which Professor Lowe introduced so elegantly, which scrutinize the social and technological infrastructures through which we understand reproduction as labor and as a biological process. Specifically, I'm interested in the relationship between technology, design, and alternative socialities of care, seeking models that generate affects of social solidarity beyond the possessive individual and nuclear family. I'll explain how this new research direction is pro-science and pro-technology, but inspired by historical critiques of techno-imaginaries and radical models of change that have their roots in women of color feminism. I'll do this by way of some of the building blocks for this inquiry that are reflected through some of my previous work. So in the recent book, Surrogate Humanity, which was co-authored with Neda Tonosowski, we critique technologies designed to replace humans in automation and warfare. In looking at the development of automation technologies, we briefly discuss the influence of Charles Darwin's writing about human emotion on the design of social robots in the late 1990s. This history is helpful in connecting the histories of colonial scientific exploration and the Mice Hub project, so it's part of connecting those 2 that I'm going to work on with you now. Specifically, it shows how technologies are designed to underwrite the feeling of autonomy and mastery for the liberal subject, what in this book we call the surrogate effect of technology. So Darwin's writing on emotion and evolution precisely captures the moment when modern scientific knowledge establishes the post-Enlightenment liberal European subject as self-identical with the category of the human. For Darwin, those who are, quote, deprived of reason, like animals, the insane, and those races distant from European man, become brute in character as they are reduced to base emotion, end quote. He explained that these primordial habits are the basis of our evolution as a species, but became vestigial now that Europeans had overcome them through civilization to represent the apex of humanity. This institutes what philosopher Sylvia Wynter calls the ontology of man. She argues that to escape the ongoingness of the colonial scientific project requires us to, quote, redescribe the human. The design prototype in social robotics is Cynthia Brazil's robot Kismet. And by the way, I'm happy to talk about any of these examples in the Q&A. I'm just going through them briefly. Kismet was designed on a model of infant-caregiver interaction and programmed with affective drives. Roboticist Brazil traces her understanding of the neural architecture of human emotion to Darwin's 1872 proposal that the, quote, emotive signaling functions were selected for during the course of evolution because of their communicative efficacy. Kismet's programming and hardware are organized around the processors, input devices, and hardware required to animate its face. Kismet's program drives, modeled on Darwin's biological drives, determine the robot's performance of an emotional state, which you saw a little bit there. So Cynthia Brazil, who's in this picture as a PhD student, Brazil's approach to emotionally expressive robots equates evolution with the ability to perform the existence of an interior psyche to the outside social world. Kismet affirms the superiority of the human subject who interacts with it by performing a lack of interiority. Why is this a problem? Because this lack of interiority is the crystallization of a racialized colonial premise that presumed so-called primitive peoples could not screen their performance of emotion, like the juvenile humans on which the Kismet system is based. Like the Mice Hub project, Kismet is a prototype for a large-scale technological infrastructure whose unstated premise is that technology should affirm the humanity of the user by assuring the human of their autonomy and superiority. This reasserts a human subject that believes in the equivalence of mastery with autonomy and fails, in Sylvia Wynter's words again, to redescribe the human and its social worlds. Instead, it replicates a singular social scientific imaginary of what the human is and what it can be because of its basis in Darwinian logic. This history of Cynthia Brazil's impact on social robotics is an example of how more often than not, technology designers uncritically reproduce prejudicial histories into infrastructure that then carry forward the same burdened version of the human. As most of you know, Darwin's half-cousin and contemporary, Francis Galton, developed his highly influential eugenic reasoning out of the same mix of scientific exploration and colonial conquest that fueled Darwin's studies. The Origin of the Species was a particular inspiration for Galton, whose work in eugenics became the origin point for what would develop into population science. The S-curve statistical model for population growth, which is what you're looking at, was developed by American biologist Raymond Pearl in the 1920s and was based on his fruit fly studies as part of the Galton Lab at University College London. By the 1970s, population science had grown to shape the policies of developmental consultants and funders like USAID and the IMF, who dictated that governments in the decolonizing world produce population growth S-curves that looked like this, sculpting the life possibilities of entire developing nations, including averted births and permitted deaths through mass scale famines and epidemics that could have been prevented by government intervention. This allowed population science to collude with racial capitalism, and as Lisa Lowe says in the book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, identify particular regions for production and others for neglect, certain populations for exploitation and others for disposal. As Michelle Murphy argues in her book, The Economization of Life, population science put reproduction at the center of how capitalism summons its world. In my first book, Life Support, I look at how, as part of colonial racialization, India's residents were figured as numerous, easily replaceable, and best suited for reproduction. My study illustrates how this discourse of race in India, and particularly of Indian workers as numerous and best suited for reproduction, becomes transformed at different moments of history, yet remains in the structuring of the global labor market today to assign social and biological reproduction work to India. I discussed changes in the Indian labor market during the global economic shift of the 1990s, which centered flexible production, technology, innovation, and scientific research on reproductivity. And as Dr. Lowe mentioned in the introduction, this period is referred to as a shift to biocapitalism. Feminist science studies scholars have defined biocapital as a form of extraction that involves isolating and mobilizing the primary reproductive agency of specific body parts. Rather than focusing only on biological science and biotech as sites for producing value, my study looks for the social logics within biological and labor markets for evidence of how capitalist accumulation has historically and continues to rely on reproductivity. Based on ethnographic data on call centers, computer programming, and gestational surrogacy, the book argues that biocapitalism and any analysis of biocapital must engage its roots in colonial labor allocation as a project of the racializing and gendering of labor. And, whoops, I gave you a sneak preview. My fieldwork for this book, I did 2 field projects. One took place in Bangalore, India in 2005 and 6, and the second took place in northwestern India in a gestational surrogacy clinic in 2008. So both of those informed this book, and after completing it, and the separate publication of some of the empirical research in the surrogacy clinic in a separate set of articles, I realized that surrogacy was in fact a more general form of a social relationship that included, but was not limited to, actual gestational surrogacy. It was also a more expansive social relationship where surrogate indicates an object or subject that supplements another subject. This relationship can be found everywhere from colonial indenture and slavery to the programming of emotive response and social robots, like the one I just showed you, and I'll explain. So from the vantage point of the study of the long history of this capture of reproductive lives and labor in the service of accumulation, the autonomy of the liberal subject looks like a ruse. This dependence on invisible and self-reproducing hands that serve remains an unscrutinized component of technological design imaginaries. The liberal subject cannot exist without human and increasingly technological surrogates, which became apparent to me through the role, the central role played by technology in each of my studies. So as I was finishing this book, I'll go back to the ethnography with information tech workers in Bangalore in 2005 and 6. I found their frustration that they raised with being unable to do what felt like creative work, the generation of new code and new platforms that was specifically targeted for an Indian audience. I found this frustration reflected in what was then a growing digital labor marketplace. So this was, again, the frustration with only having access with the data equivalent of service work, cleaning up code that someone else wrote, reproducing projects that were invented in other countries for other markets, rather than interests in India. In fact, around that time, in 2012, Lily Irani, a computer science and scientist and STS scholar, told me about Amazon Mechanical Turk, which I'll refer to as AMT, in relation to that earlier research. The AMT Internet Marketplace is a software platform where employers can post what are called human intelligence tasks with a price for each task. Just out of curiosity, have any of you participated as either a requester or a Turker in this economy? No one would admit. Sometimes people have. In the world of coding and online retail, programmers continue to struggle to come up with the holy grail of artificial intelligence. That is, software that can use algorithms to categorize the seemingly infinite amounts of user-generated data we have. So personal photos, rants in the blogosphere, kitten humor, all these things that we generate, to translate those into value-producing data sets for e-commerce. A 2016 Pew survey found that half of Turkers make less than $5 an hour, even working full-time. And in 2010, AMT was utilizing mainly workers from the US and India. So there was a direct correlation between the kind of reproductive data service work happening in India in real time and also online. AMT is a recent technology that was considered revolutionary in the world of e-commerce and informatics, and in which I also find the issues of reproduction, gendering, and racialization very apparent, but it engages subjects who don't fit within a stable identity-based model, whether that be national, ethnic, or class-bound. The extension of the politics of difference and of subjection into the realm of the digital, whereas Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos once joked, AMT provides humans as a service, is a problem that we take up in the book Surrogate Humanity. AMT is obviously an example of a new iteration of outsourcing. And outsourced work, which is composed of nodes in the production process that are generally understood to be non-innovative and therefore reproductive, is generally devalued, even though it enables the high-valued and much more high-compensated creative and innovative labor that makes intellectual production centers like Silicon Valley possible. Silicon Valley would not exist the way it does now without crowdsourcing work like Amazon Mechanical Turk. And this relationship is much like the way that Marxist feminists describe the role of reproductive labor in the home home as an economic unit, where the gendered labor of the wife reproduces the humanity of the worker who goes into the public sphere. So technologies like AMT provide new ways to think about the relationship between gender and labor, as the historical gendering of what is deemed non-creative and non-innovative reproductive work is the essential work for the success of startups who reap its benefits. Yet still, that reproductive work carries forward this negative valuation that comes from its origin in the private sphere. So the surrogate effect of technologies, like the surrogate effect of reproductive labor in the household, as I'm going to go into in a moment, or in the commercial surrogacy clinic itself, where I kind of first put these things together, is to, again, underwrite the supposed autonomy of the liberal subject, even while performing the necessary invisible labor that makes this experience of mastery and autonomy possible in the first place. So now I'm going to take up the surrogate effect of reproductive labor and technology in the Surrogacy Clinic to show how surrogates as workers and subjects themselves point to ways to radically reconsider sociality and relationality. So at the Manushi Clinic, where I did my 2008 ethnographic research, commissioning mothers, which is the legal term for the intended parent, so commissioning mothers and sometimes fathers were invited into the embryology lab in sterilized suits and masks to view the forming embryo under the microscope on day 2 following conception, at which point it's called a blastocyst. And obviously this would never happen in the US. One of the directors of the clinic explained that this helps commissioning mothers bond with the fetus. It's not even an embryo yet. The very idea that there is something with which to bond here depends on the externalization of the developing embryo from the uterus of the gestational surrogate, but also the microscope as instrument, and the visualization and discourse of the fetus as it will develop into a subject in its own right. There's a lot going on in this bonding moment, right? DNA from parental gametes and the parental intention that's bound into the surrogacy contract explains who is supposed to bond with the cells under the microscope. Geneticization is a process by which genetics has come to explain health and disease and to naturalize social difference as biologically based. And it operates in scenes like the one I just explained to you to naturalize genetic descent as legitimate parentage, and egg donors and surrogates as providers of what Melinda Cooper and Catherine Waldby have called services in the self. That is, services that rely on in vivo biological processing and the utilization of the worker's living substrate as essential elements in the reproductive process. As a metaphor, DNA implies a hierarchical ordering, so that the intended parents as the source of DNA have more right to control the process of surrogacy than the surrogate herself, because they are positioned as creative authors of the fetus. And legally speaking, the fetus is more like their property than anything else. The surrogate is, in opposition, figured legally as a service provider in the contracts. So in the articles I've written out of this ethnographic study, I've talked about how visualizing technologies like the microscope, but also ultrasonography in obstetrics, marginalize the pregnant person and render them as purely bodily labor and passive bodily labor, empowering the genetic and property claims of commissioning parents to the infant born through surrogacy. I've also written about how this informs how surrogates are compensated with very low wages in comparison to the other costs of surrogacy, but also very minimal health entitlements. And these are conditions that haven't changed over time, because this study was in 2008 through 2016. So in embryology labs, like the one I just described, and fertility clinics like Manushi, we can see practitioners working towards manifesting worldviews, imaginaries, into futures. Worldviews that imagine away the body and nurture work of the so-called gestational carrier in favor of the lovable blastocyst under glass and the isolated fetus that we see in ultrasound imaging. And there's a vast literature on this in feminist science and technology studies that we can talk about if you want to. In my ongoing research on assisted reproductive technology, as well as technologies that capitalize on making reproductive labor invisible and undercompensated, so for example, Amazon Mechanical Turk, I've been studying how technologies and the economies of social reproduction require us to not only scrutinize new physical relationships between bodies, but also to see the contest over how new socialities are forming around these technologies. So there's a power struggle going on. It's not a simple cut and dry process. And as the examples from the embryology lab and in that S-curve in population studies that I showed you, as these are meant to illustrate, such worldviews have important political content when we think about how technologies and their governance can materialize one particular reality or worldview over others, and how being the subject of medical risk or of resource extraction usually means not having access to influencing how technologies materialize futures. So in my research on the global outsourcing of this work of care, service, and even childbirth, I've continued to look for and find practices that challenge the reproduction of racialized and gendered norms of family. Also the household economy and the gendering and sexual practices that go with them. For example, in the late 80s and early 90s, when India took an International Monetary Fund loan to stabilize its currency and started instituting the structural adjustment policies that paved the way for outsourcing, feminist scholars were starting to publish critiques of the then still relatively new imaging technologies in obstetrics that I just kind of touched on briefly. At the same time, world leaders began focusing on the individual and the family as key economic units for state policy. Not a coincidence, but a central part of the shift away from the social welfare state, which is what I want to talk about briefly now. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher famously encapsulated a new historical feeling, the feeling of being a neoliberal subject, when she said, quote, "There is no such thing as society. There are individuals and there are families," end quote. I want to point out two things that are happening in Thatcher's statement. First, it's a phantasmagram. A phantasmagram, according to historian of science Michelle Murphy, explains how large abstract concepts describing the social world then bring themselves into existence by guiding human practice. And Murphy says that the economy, the macroeconomy, these are phantasmagrams, abstract ideas that guide our behavior to actually make them material. The free market was a fiction in which a strong belief commanded the building of infrastructures, policies, and behaviors. Less obvious are the affective infrastructures brought into being as a result of this phantasmagram of the free market. Here, for example, Thatcher's individuals and families as an alternative reality to social collectivity, which is one way to think about the move for a social welfare state. The second thing that Thatcher's statement does is assert the end of society as a collective project, that is, the end of social solidarity. The modern nuclear family as an ideal is a relatively recent invention. A set of people living together in one household economic unit, which is recognized through tax reporting, shared medical insurance, school enrollment, death benefits, visitation, custody rights, etc. In reality, of course, most households do not match this imaginary of the nuclear family. And in his book about early 20th century San Francisco titled Contagious Divides, historian Nyan Shah described a set of intimacies and domesticities that did not replicate the idealized capitalist citizen subject forming at that time, which was the white middle-class nuclear family and its residents. Shah called these queer domesticities. He looked at several examples, including bachelor immigrant households, but we can include contemporary examples like co-ops, blended families, single mothers who swap childcare on an informal basis, grandparents housing and supporting adult children and grandchildren, and so forth. Yet, the state continues to offer full rights and social welfare benefits, those little that remain, only to families constructed through a legal marriage contract. Or I should say primarily, too. By saying queer domesticities refuse to reproduce the nation, I'm not celebrating them, as they are also often testimony to the fact that low-resource contexts lead to creative living solutions that arise because the state refuses to recognize them as legitimate sites for rights and social welfare entitlements. But for today, we can look at these queer domesticities as protesting the reproduction of the nation because they destabilize that white nuclear family norm. And I'm just going to take a minute to talk a little bit about how feminist theorists have talked about the household as an economic unit. So scholars including Maria Mies, Carol Pateman, and Janet Jacobson have argued that marriage, the state's preferred way of recognizing domesticity and family, has also historically been a labor contract. Specifically, a labor contract that creates the subordinated economic position of wife within the household unit. Of course, women of color feminists, including Angela Davis, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, Chela Sandoval, Dorothy Roberts, Bell Hooks, among many others, have pointed out that immigrant and low-resource women have always done their own household labor, plus underpaid work in the households of wealthier, often white families, historically. So Maria Mies, in her book, Patriarchy and the Accumulation of Capital, says that the marriage contract was what made the nuclear family possible. creating a new historical, economic, domestic form which replaced wages for labor. With marriage, love would now be the compensation for labor in the household, no wages. Janet Jacobson explains how the household economic unit has also helped support the fiction that the liberal subject is free and autonomous. She says this freedom is a fiction because it relies on the subordination of invisibilized and devalued support labor. The historical male head of household could not survive without the labor of wife, children, servants, and slaves, erased through the marriage contract, as well as the strict limits on what counts as family under the law. Mies goes on to explain that the modern marriage contract set up a model of unpaid labor in the private sphere, the home, that is then extended through globalization to encompass the formerly colonized world's labor economies. So we can add casualized labor, including many forms of crowdsourced digital work like AMT, sweatshop work, customer service call center work, all extend from the model of unpaid and underpaid labor in the gendered private sphere. These forms of labor have little in common except they have little in common except they are deemed to be uncreative or reproductive, and therefore, while they are performed by people of any gender, the work itself is feminized, and this is the process that in the late 70s Mies called housewifization, which doesn't roll off the tongue but makes sense. Now I want to talk about one particular example of how gendered labor gets superimposed onto the formerly colonized world from my research on transnational surrogacy. Surrogacy is one example of an outsourced labor market, of course, one that follows the map of colonialism to provide the support labor that helps make the seemingly autonomous citizen subject seem possible at all. I mentioned earlier that I had done field work with international participants in an Indian assisted reproductive technology clinic in early 2008, and at that point the practice was still very new in India. There were only a few clinics offering this service, and people outside of India were just starting to hear about it. I followed the development of what then grew to become what some called an industry, tracking legal debates, draft legislation, feminist organizing, and policy work in India, as well as discussions in Europe and the US about the ethics of becoming commissioning parents, because these are the places where most commissioning parents were coming from. At one point, when I was spending my days in the clinic, I was asked to step in for one of the two doctors who was translating for a conversation between a woman who intended to be a surrogate and a man who intended to commission a surrogacy. So the commissioning father from New York is named David, and the intended surrogate, is named Pushpa. So after they're introduced, the doctor walks off. And I should say that David was using, and his wife, who did not come on this trip, were using donated eggs. And Pushpa, the surrogate, is here exploring the extent of his intentions towards her and her family. She asks if he would be willing to bring her family to the US and help them find jobs. This is quite early in the conversation. And he's, of course, a bit startled. He says something like, oh, yes, of course, I want to help you educate your children. And maybe someday you could come to the US, perhaps. But by the end of their contract 9 months later, he described his insurmountable frustration with her continued attempts to, as he said, get more money from him and his wife every time they communicated. I found a general insistence among women who had previously been surrogates or were currently when I was there that it should be common sense that commissioning parents would want to have a responsibility to them indefinitely after the child is born. So this was coupled with an idea of the idea that surrogacy is something, yes, it's a contracted form of service or labor, but it's also much more than what money could represent. And actually, in my work, I talk about how there's a precedent for this kind of relationship between someone with sort of minimal resources and power in society and someone with much greater resources and power in society. When the lower positioned person does something great for the person with more power, that person is responsible for the other person indefinitely. So there's a historical precedent for this. And as I mentioned before, the work of care, nurture, and attention in biological gestation and surrogacy is devalued because it's gendered, not just because women do it, but because the services as work are gendered. It's outsourced to racialized nations like India and performed by their citizens as underpaid labor. But thinking back to Nyan Shah's study of queer domesticities, again in 1930 San Francisco, I want to think about how this moment in the clinic also suggests that the work of care could lead to new forms of sociality, and maybe even lead us to think about how institutions can change. So the notions of family have actually been shifting in response to mostly lawsuits regarding surrogacy practices transnationally. So we're in the process right now in contemporary life of figuring out what it means to be able to mix bodies and the social meaning of family in these ways. So can we think of the assertion of some surrogates that they should have a lasting connection to the families they contracted with for a surrogacy really be understood as absurd or impossible? So it's a kind of question to hold, because that's how it was framed in the clinic by doctors and commissioning parents. This is a 9-month contract, it's not a forever contract. Referencing women of color feminism and queer of color critiques as examples, Grace Hong and Rod Ferguson argue that devalued subjects and social relations require new analytics through which to apprehend coalitional possibilities, or what they call strange affinities. I see the repeated statement by surrogates that they feel they should be in an ongoing reciprocal relationship with commissioning parents as a call for those parents to think about a collective investment. Could we imagine models of recognizing collectives that can replace social and legal recognition of just the family? Models that could destabilize the privileging of some citizens and subjects over others? Models that would challenge the power relation of the social contract, the marriage contract, the surrogacy contract? As we know, many people are also already living in collectives, those queer domesticities that the nation has tried to warn us away from. So my current work pursues the questions I've set up for you today. What other possible forms of sociality, care, and relation can we open up through rethinking, specifically here, techno-scientific infrastructures? And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some of the projects I'm working on now. So my current research aims to not only analyze the structures I've described, but to change them. I'm going to briefly talk about ways I've aligned marginalized scientific research with marginalized social voices in my work, and also have found ways to directly impact STEM fields by presenting key issues in science and technology to an audience that's directly impacted by these, but often excluded from debates. And as I mentioned before, to go back to this surrogacy clinic question, the women who participate in surrogacy have not described their role as simply or as one-dimensionally as have social representations of surrogacy, which often talk about wombs for rent, right? There are medical and legal correlations with that, where the surrogate is positioned as a temporary service provider. Surrogates don't describe their role this way. I mentioned that many surrogates had said they felt their influence on this developing embryo and fetus was permanent, and that commissioning families should therefore experience an enduring connection to them and their families through a sense of something like responsibility that would defy this genetic logic of connection that only happens through DNA. I talked about geneticization. So in response to this kind of call, I sought and found research in immunology that validates the biological reality behind what surrogates were expressing. So one example of that is a phenomenon called fetal cell microchimerism, and I can talk about this again more in the Q&A. It's a field of research that was actually marginalized itself until the last 10 years, and even though it's been around since the 70s. And in immunology, it explores the exchange of cells between the gestational body and the fetal body during pregnancy. Cells actually do go back and forth across the placental barrier, which people didn't know until the 70s and ignored until the 90s. This exchange occurs in both directions between the fetus and the gestational body, and the cells continue to circulate in both bodies for years after the delivery. And as Susan Elizabeth Kelly notes, the discovery of this phenomenon challenges the notion of the immune self, which is the basic tenet of immunology. But on an ontological level, it also challenges the previous biological understandings that we have of this barrier between the pregnant person and the fetus. And that's a barrier that not only maintains the separate biological cells, but correlates to this idea of the separate legal, biolegal individual. based in geneticization and DNA. So it contests the understanding of individuals as discretely bound organisms. And for gestational surrogacy, whose model of legal parental rights is mediated through geneticism and property, the disturbance of this nature-culture category of the bio and social self uses an argument based in DNA against geneticism, supporting arguments that surrogates make about their influence on the developing fetus. It also supports this extended timeline that surrogates assert for their effect on the fetal and maternal bodies on one another. So as I mentioned, in the time since completing Surrogate Humanity a few years ago, I've moved some of my research agenda to impact STEM fields directly through the pedagogy and practice of technology design. As director of the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis, I've been able to steward social change-oriented STEM projects by funding collaborative groups that bring together expertise in feminist research and ethnic and community histories on the one hand, with technical expertise on the other. So for example, I'm co-PI with Dr. Sarah McCullough on a National Science Foundation grant called Innovations in Graduate Education. And we're developing new curricula for science and engineering departments to train PhD students to incorporate historical injustice and exclusions into their assessment of the design and impact of their studies and final projects. So here's one visual representing the challenges to feminist STEM and then visions for what it can be. So based on a year-long working group process and advisory board feedback, we're currently designing and testing 3 levels of curriculum for graduate students that uses the insights of feminist science and technology studies and ethnic studies to train current PhD students to consider histories like those I've shared today as they work to imagine what kind of technology infrastructures we can build to enable a different future. So again, working with worldviews and imaginaries, which is something that people in social sciences and humanities are well trained to do, is actually something that can be used in STEM. And to build a larger community around this NSF research, we've started a subcommittee within the Society for the Social Study of Science that's dedicated to feminist STEM technology. So it's not even just at UC Davis. And I'm also one of 3 senior researchers on a team of 11 authors who've written a book manuscript called Techno-Precarious, which is a bit of a lofty title, but I kind of like it. And Techno-Precarious includes a chapter on care as a methodology, a political methodology and a research methodology. Based in the University of Michigan's Precarity Lab, the book takes up the problem of new forms of precarity created by technology, including extraction economies, the failure of mainstream medicine to meet trans health needs, the negative impacts of automation on Medicare and Medicaid, among many other topics. And we look at these through both policy-based thinking and also models of collectives and care that can address some of these failures. And as with the book Techno-Precarious, frameworks of care structure the analysis and political stakes of another example of my current work. As the convener of a 10-week residential group at the University of California Humanities Research Institute, I got to work with a group of social scientists who study science and technology and also, like me, collaborate with scientists in their research. And after 10 weeks of sort of working together and hosting our collaborators, we co-wrote what we are calling a pocket guide to feminist science. Whereas the NSF project aims to build curriculum to train STEM researchers in feminist approaches, the pocket guide is meant to be used in the field. In other words, it's written as a short introduction to the problems of non-feminist approaches to science, as well as providing some entry-level tools for feminist practice. Care and research practice is one of our central analytics, and this is just the introduction to that chapter. The tone is meant to be light and fun so that a variety of people can actually engage it. But our first chapter actually starts with introducing the imperial history of scientific exploration, and I can come back to this slide and talk about it during the Q&A. Coming to a bookstore near you. Okay, so technologies of reproduction and care are poised to redefine the human and our social fabric. The mice hab example we began with is a technology of imagined colonization, proposing to populate a new space with self-reproducing generations, an imagination that comes out of the failed and dangerous logics of eugenics, population science, and technologies of reproduction that have been, by design, meant to subjugate the majority of humans in service of capital accumulation and the fiction of autonomy for a few. we obviously need new models for interdependent human care to enrich our technological imaginaries. These models would necessarily think outside of nation, family, or even the human. My critiques, along with those of other feminist science and technology scholars like Ruha Benjamin, who I know is just here, Kim Tallbear, Angie Willey, these are a call for attention to the role of social reproduction in carrying forward histories of genocide, slavery, and colonialism in science. Attention that can inform the design of new social and technological infrastructures to help redescribe the human. At the end of society, whether this is due to the threat of planet-wide extinction or simply the unfurling of Thatcherian anti-mutual aid individualism, care that underwrites social solidarity has to hedge risk to the welfare and comfort of the liberal individual. For me, a response to the critique of technology design I've presented today must overcome a deep denial of interdependence, a denial that serves the long and oppressive history of the liberal subject's dependence on false proof of its own autonomy. Thank you. And I'm ready to do questions or show and tell, whichever people prefer.
So my friend had to leave early, so I have a question that they left for me.
Asking for a friend.
Yes, okay, so how, if at all, do you understand your work as in conversation with Black feminist praxis, or in surrogacy is embedded in the history of the enslaved Black female, both literally and figuratively?
Okay, so in the book Surrogate Humanity, I think they might be asking about Elise Eve Weinbaum's new book, but they're not here, so we can't know. So for me, I would say that in the book Surrogate Humanity, we start with Saidiya Hartman's observation historically that the relationship between master and slave, in that relationship, the slave, Hartman says, functions as a surrogate self for the master. And actually, we start with that observation because it's a fundamental social and economic relationship upon which American racial capitalism is founded, and because that model is structuring the literal political economy of what we're analyzing, we start there. So the notion of the surrogate relation actually begins with Saidiya Hartman's work. And the book ends with Hortense Spiller's work on what it means to ungender or to have no gender when you're talking about bodies. And we think about this kind of imaginary in the development of technologies that are supposed to do everything that a person does socially, to be animate. Like we actually talk about sex robotics. To be animate, to be objects of desire, to even simulate consent and the reciprocation of desire, yet to be absent of a subjectivity. And we wonder, where does that desire come from? And we think alongside of Black feminists and the work they've done on the captive reproductive body, the ungendered captive reproductive body, to think about where that desire comes from. And we don't reach any conclusions, but I would say that that's how some of, at least specific Black feminist scholars have shaped some of that thinking. Yeah.
This was such a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I have two questions about the two different parts of the talk. The first was about the demographics of the women who are surrogates. Because their challenge is really about temporality, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, give us a little more context about who they are and where they are in their own sort of family settings. Do they do this when they've already had a couple kids? Is this before they have kids? If you can just give us a little bit more about that, because I thought that was really
absolutely
interesting. And then my other question is about Kismet. I have to confess, I'm working on a project. I'm just starting a project on race and brainwashing and automatons, and so that was really interesting to see. I would love to know why Kismet is named Kismet. Is that an acronym? And I think I thought what I saw was, what do they call it, heterochromia, when the two eyeballs are different colors and they were also changing colors. So I just wondered if you could tell us anything about the design of it, and if you have a racial reading of that.
Okay, I'm going to go backwards. I saw that, so if you want to see Kismet's physical form, you can go to the MIT Museum, and their permanent robotics display has poor Kismet taken into parts. And the eyeballs were the same color, and they're not illuminated, so I think it might just be crummy visuals. Sorry. But go and see, because that would be really interesting. And you asked me about you mean the physical design of the robot? It's very basic. So the idea is that they watched many videos of adults interacting with children, whether they were parents or daycare providers, in her lab. They studied this, and this is a very kind of well-trod trope in the psychology of child development. And they watched the way that the juveniles, children, right, would reproduce the emotive expression of the adults, kind of mirroring it. And if you read Cynthia Brazile's technical papers, she's looking at the psychology of childhood development alongside this kind of theorization of emotional drives that Darwin has presented, which is very basic and also infantilizing in its basic conception of what is primitive, right? So the idea is that there's an evolutionary model of the human, and children reproduce it, like Freud said, right? And so primitive human equals juvenile child. Therefore, Darwin's theory of drives should work for this robot that's meant to be like a child interacting with the caregiver. So, in terms of the design of the neural network, if you want to call it that, it's based on 6 drives. And the robot is programmed to be easily upset, and it's programmed to want approval. And all of this is expressed through eyebrows, eye movement, and then eyelids for the most part. It doesn't have much else of a face here. Let's go back to Kismet. So what's really interesting is then to look at how social robotics, and I can't talk about this, it's just a teaser, gets used in therapy for children who have autism spectrum disorder. And they're used to teach and kind of rationalize affective performance in children who it's been decided aren't doing this. And so the idea is that robots are very predictable and repetitive, and that this is helpful in that kind of therapy. And I don't have a stance on it, I haven't read all the research, but that's one direction that this history has really gone into. And then, I don't know, am I taking up too much time answering this? Because I can answer the surrogacy question too, because it's easy. I've written a bunch of articles that I would encourage you to read, where I kind of go through the demographics, and then there are other studies that we've correlated our data. So at this clinic, which is a big one, most of the women who come there have come from the kind of wider region, but not farther than 1 or 2 days travel, and have a range of education levels, but on average around what we would call an 8th grade education. They come from all the castes in India, but are skewed towards lower castes, and are all women at this clinic. And even in draft legislation, it was mandated that women should have already born 1 child naturally themselves. And this is both to test the viability of their uterus, also to, on some level, it's imagined that this will prevent the surrogate from wanting to keep the child that she has. So were there specific other things you wanted to know? Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I and other researchers on surrogacy talk about is how women are encouraged to live in hostels after their first trimester, away from their own children and extended families. So someone else is taking care of their families in their place, and they're isolated for their own good, supposedly, right, but also for surveillance. So to rest, but also to be surveilled. And this is something that's shown to be very reassuring to commissioning parents who know what's going on with the gestation process. So it's all out there in articles and books. Amrita Pandey has a book, and Sharmila Rodrupa as well. So yeah. In the back, and then on.
As I look at the race and class dynamics of surrogacy within the U.S., my sense is commonly high SES, white couple, lower SES, white woman. Is that?
Can you say the last part again?
My sense is that typically you're talking about higher SES, white couple, lower SES, white woman. Is that?
It's actually quite diverse in terms of couples who, and individuals who hire surrogates. I'm not, actually I don't study the US, so I'm not up to date on the scholarship, but actually there's an undergraduate here doing an honors thesis on this, you're a student, right, Mary? So we'll have to ask her. Yeah. And Rod, you had a question.
Yeah, I love this talk. And I mean, first of all, I just love the use of women of color feminism as the basis for thinking alternatives to STS. I was really interested in, I want to hear you talk more about the kind of alternative formations and strange affinities that come out of, you know, sort of dominant configurations like the commissioning parent and the surrogate. And I kept thinking of Octavia Butler's work with the Xenogenesis series, but also the short story, Bloodchild, you know, and in both the series and the story, it's all about the sort of strange affinities between the commissioning, parentheses, alien parent, the surrogate human, you know, parent, and the sort of ethics of care that can be involved in that. And so, you know, anyway, so any thoughts about, or your thoughts about the sort of strange affinities that can come about, you know, from the sort of conventional configurations?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and this is something that I don't have examples of that are as exciting as Octavia Butler's work, where, you know, isn't there a song by some mainstream band called Caring is Creepy or something? I feel like that's getting into the, you know, like the strange affinities that are also sometimes a little, like where care becomes creepy. But I, you know, the way I'm thinking about it, because what I've really studied is the relationship between law, the imaginary of biogenetics, not even what's really there in the data, the imaginary of biogenetics, and then the social reality of how we organize social reproduction, aka care here for today. When I'm looking at that sort of triangle, what I'm thinking about is how does it get disrupted so that people can try other things? And so in the surrogacy clinic, the issue is we have the struggle to maintain the rights and domain of the nuclear family, even though all these other people involved, because we have egg donors, sometimes sperm donors, definitely a gestational carrier. We have one, often two, legal individuals who are positioned to have sole custody and something like property rights to this infant that will be born. And so all of this work is going into sustaining this kind of idea of the nuclear family that actually lives out through these infrastructures, right? So how do we know who the father is? The missing father, we do a DNA test on Jerry Springer, right? That whole thing is actually here in the clinic. And so to me, the argument, to answer your question, I would say, rather than pointing to specific examples, I would think about what would it mean, and I asked this question with feminist lawyers, so I can tell you what the answer was, but what would it mean to have a legal structure that protected the relationship between a woman who gestated and gave birth to a child for another family to care for? What would it mean to have a relationship between her community and that community? And would that be something that could be legally protected? And actually Laura Foster, who is a feminist science and technology scholar and has worked on the patenting of indigenous, I would call them technologies or knowledges in different parts of Africa, has worked with different groups to actually sue for property rights to practices that have been passed down through generations for cultivating, specifically her books about Hoodia, for cultivating and caring for a plant that actually doesn't produce pharmacological results without this very, very specific kind of care and propagation. And the community she was working with wanted to have not just, you know, to be compensated for their work and their, you know, the actual plants, but to have some kind of, I would call it intellectual property rights to everything that comes out of that plant. And they succeeded. So she told me about this because there's a, you know, kind of, for me, a legal interest in something like that. And so I wish, you know, I think it would be more exciting and interesting to think about the sort of imaginations for possibility of what other formations would look like. But I am someone who works with law and labor. And so for working with law and labor, what I'm thinking about is how can we actually change laws to redistribute the fruits of our labor so that they support more people and then aren't always channeled. And another story, a colleague of mine had done one of these, again, this is getting financial and legal, not very imaginary, but a colleague of mine had saved money in one of these designated college savings funds for a child that she lost, and wanted to give the savings to another person who was going to college, which was the dedicated reason for having the savings, but legally could not because this child wasn't her legal progeny. So there's this commitment to a kind of social good that does not translate in the legal realm. So that's kind of what I'm interested in, finding out how people have kind of transgressed in ways that have then been incorporated back into the law, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Like tag onto Rod's question, which helped me formulate the thing that I was thinking about, but didn't have a question about. Maybe between the what we call the imaginary and the legal and labor, there are other but in the spirit of imagining other relationships, as you were talking about a lifelong kind of an understanding of kind of a lifelong commitment to care and responsibility. And it's that time of the year. I couldn't help but think about recommendation letters. as a format.
Yeah.
And I think it's reproductive labor.
Yeah.
It's kind of lifelong bondage. Sorry. As you do when you sign on to it, you're taking on the student as your recommended student for maybe until you die.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is there's a sense of responsibility, and you don't even have to love it. You just do it because it's what needs to be done. So I think that's a very interesting and non-contractual.
Yeah.
It's not a contractual relationship, but it's an interesting kind of responsibility and sociability, something coming together that we have accepted as part of what one does. Even if you're oh my God, I have so much work already. But it's not even about but you believe in it. So it doesn't have to be pleasurable in the moment, but you do derive some pleasure in the larger project of supporting your students and their future prospects. So I think it's kind of an interesting model that we do employ in our everyday lives.
Yeah, it is. I agree. Actually, I would say that it is a model for what I asked for at the end, which was, do we have examples for how we give up autonomy and a feeling of superiority for the good of something that's larger than us, right? Yeah. And it's uncomfortable. I think it has to be. Yeah, Lisa, you had a question.
I was just thinking about it's very moving the way in which the birth mother has this sense of asking for responsibility over the course of the lifetime, not only to the child, but to her and to her extended family and community. And it reminds me a little bit of Dipesh Chakrabarty's ideas about the worker who, through puja and so forth, has a whole cultural meaning around labor that goes beyond what a sociological or even Marxist political economic analysis of labor would be able to explain. And I was just wondering where culture comes into this, knowing that you also are interested in anthropology.
Yeah. Well, I guess I've also written about this, but again, I guess I've been working with these feminist organizations so much, I immediately translated that into how do we get compensation for it. But so what I was going to say is that one of the things that you'll find in my ethnography, but also when other people have written about conversations they've had with surrogates as anthropologists, is that women say this thing that I did isn't work, it's not a job, we don't want to unionize. In fact, people have tried to unionize surrogates and they don't, in general, haven't, it's changing, want to be unionized because of this very idea that this isn't work, it's something much more important. And the kind of conversations that get repeated over and over about this being exceeding even what humans can do for each other is more like what God can do. And of course, the clinic directors tell these stories as a kind of example of the altruism of the surrogates who are doing this because they believe it's good, not because they are desperate for the money or whatever the fears are of the commissioning parent. So it's tricky to separate what is the cultural, authentic, feeling and real and worldview there from all the ways that it plays out. But what I would say is that there's, in the same way that I took women at their word when they said, I know for a fact my body has had a long-term impact on this child that I gave birth to. Whether or not your contract says it, I know it. Then I went to look for the science to back that up. So I would say, if someone tells me what I did is far more than money can compensate me for, what I really think is appropriate here is a connection between our social worlds, so that if I get in trouble later, a kind of insurance, right? A kind of social insurance. Then I say the thing that's culturally important is that commitment to a sense of this exceeding the labor contract, and the entitlement should be to something that matches the magnitude of the work. Yeah. Yes.
This wonderful talk. I was particularly fascinated by the bit you told us at the end about your collaborative work with scientists and engineers. And I was struck that the point that you were using Kismet to me was that our technologies often are designed to reinforce our sense of mastery and autonomy. Of course, there are many occasions when things don't go as planned and they then make us feel utterly helpless, right? But we don't usually design technology to have any other effect. So I wonder what your vision for feminist engineering is. What role does technology play for feminists?
Well, it's funny, whenever Neda and I give talks out of the Surrogate Humanity book, there always someone will bring up the question of what about the fact that technologies are often, they feel like they're mastering us, right? I'm frustrated, I don't understand why my computer's in a bad mood today. We project all these things onto our technologies. And actually there are several interesting articles about, in feminist science and technology studies, about how technologies make us serve them, sort of taking that perspective. That doesn't inform my work personally, but if you're interested. So visions for, so let me see if I understand the question.
What kind of technology should feminists be designing?
What kind, should, okay, I'm gonna take out the word should and say could. So this is one that I happen to have ready. A roboticist that came out of the same lab as, well, not the same lab, but the same program as Cynthia Brazil, which is MIT's Media Lab. Cynthia Brazil was in social robotics. Kelly Dobson was in, well, she was actually in social robotics, but she worked with a mentor. So Cynthia Brazil's mentor was Roger Books, who's really very famous in the creation of intelligence, artificial intelligence. So OMO was Kelly Dobson's robot, which is part of a larger project called Machine Therapy. And so OMO, we argue in Surrogate Humanity, is something like a feminist robot, though we don't say that. So what it is, and you can find the video on YouTube if you want, it's about this big orb. It's got this green kind of squishy coating on the outside that feels a bit like skin. It has a little hole where air can go in and out, and it's composed of these expandable ribs and a balloon inside that can increase and decrease, kind of like our lungs when we breathe. And the program that runs it, the kind of AI we could call it, it's very simple, is designed to respond to pressure stimulus. So if it feels something pressing on it quickly or slowly, it can respond by expanding or contracting, pressing back quickly or slowly. And she runs you, in her concept video, she runs you through how this object is meant to be therapeutic for humans, for animals, and for machines, because it works on frequencies from, vibrational, the speed of like a washing machine vibration, to like what a mammal would produce through lung capacity. And she makes a great point of detailing the programming, because it is programmed to lead or follow a pattern of breathing. So it's not what she calls a sort of obedient service robot, and she juxtaposes it to robots like this, Pearl the Nurse Bot, which is, I guess, a non-feminist robot. Definitely a non-feminist robot. So it's a project between Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. And it's meant, actually, it's kind of a prototype for care robotics that would be used in retirement facilities and skilled nursing facilities. And it has very basic functions. Its functions are, it can dispense pharmaceuticals, it can take biometrics, And it can interact with you in this kind of screen with a kind of survey that's not unlike the one you get when you're admitted to the hospital or when you go for a checkup, right? How are you feeling today? Are you in pain? A scale of 1 to 10. So that's what it does, but it's imagined to replace nurses, caregivers, companions, adult children, grandchildren, pets, all these things. That's how the prototype is imagined. So what Dobson argues is this, if it were ever out of prototype and into a mass production, would drastically narrow the experience and actually our kind of common sense of what care can and should be between humans, because that's how infrastructure works. And so OMO is a critique, it leads and it follows. It's meant to soothe, but not just to soothe. It's got erratic programming noise, so it can sort of misbehave at times. It's not what she would say is not meant to model neurotypicality. So the idea is to disrupt that feeling of autonomy by having interdependence and that feeling of mastery. It doesn't always obey. So an example. I don't know if it's my ideal feminist robot, but it's definitely an interesting one. Let's see. Other questions yet?
So I'm sort of interested in like the law, and like I'm nervous about this question because I think it requires a lot of conjecture, but it seems like you might be open to it. I'm thinking about how contracts are sort of these like legal mechanisms for containing certain types of excess, social excess in terms of relations, the marriage contract, or the marriage certificate becoming a kind of labor contract being a really, I think, salient example. So I guess I'm wondering, I guess I'm wondering about the history of the surrogacy contract and also the future, which is to say, like, has the contract always sort of been a part of the sort of like contemporary phenomenon of surrogacy? So like, however you want to.
Those are all really great questions. I mean, I see why. I mean, they're about many things, but the history. So the history of the contract. When did it start? In the U.S., case law precedent is that there were in some of the first surrogacy cases, the woman who was the surrogate sued for custody. So in the U.S., the reason the contract exists is to protect the custodial rights of the intending parents. So in India, that precedent does not exist. And so in India, the surrogacy contract looks very different if you look at the actual contracts. And we never got to a point where there was a nationally mandated form for the contract. So that's one thing. Transnational surrogacy was banned at the end of 2016. And so there was never a formal design for the contract. Also, the contract acted as a fiction in the experience of most of the women who were surrogates because they never saw it. They never got to keep a copy, and most of them were not in positions where they could actually have legal representation if they wanted to sue for their rights under the contract. So it's a fiction that, if anything, would protect the commissioning parents, and it's more of an informational document meant to tell, especially the commissioning parents, specifically what their rights are, and to tell the surrogate what the expectations are. For example, you get maintenance stipends each trimester until the delivery, at which point you get your actual payment. You don't get to decide about abortions. You don't get to decide how many embryos to carry to term. The commissioning parents and the physician get to decide. So there are many things like this that are in the contract, and it's used as an informational document in that way for the surrogates, but in terms of actual legal efficacy. And maybe we can talk about the long history of the labor contract afterwards. It's very long. It goes back to indenture. Any last questions?